الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. I begin in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. May the peace and blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon His final messenger Muhammad and his blessed and purified progeny. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers, dear sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Inshallah, as has been mentioned, the subject today is worldview, what it is and why it matters. Before I begin, I think some clarifications are due. Since the last session that I had, the joint session with me and Shaykh Abdul Rahman, the question, what is tradition, has come up multiple times. It came up during the lecture and it came up after the lecture. So there has to be a clarification because that reference to tradition is used within the context of this conference, within the various lectures you've heard, including my own, and within various writings as well and books that you would have probably purchased within this conference. People have a phobia from the word tradition in the sense that they understand it to mean either one, culture, meaning that one person approached me and said, we try to rid ourselves of certain traditions, you're trying to reinforce them. No, we're not referring to culture by tradition. Others see it as a return to the past, or those who glorify the past. Tradition is not in reference to a historical point in time. It's in reference to a return to God. And that's why we explicitly stated that tradition and religion can be used interchangeably. Rene Guénon decided to use it that way. Not just him. Other religious figures and denominations and groups and followers of a belief system that entailed a creator, those who held a divine worldview, used the word tradition. Why? Because the word religion and anything to do with religion there was a phobia that existed within Europe as a result of what took place in the Middle Ages, as a result of the treatment of scientists, the treatment of general, not just scientists, general populations suffered under the church, and as such, till this very day, even when you go to Europe and you open the television and you watch the series that are produced every year, you'll find series that always show priests and religious figures taking advantage of religion to control societies, to use them to their advantage and to control them in various ways, and to abuse that power, just to reinforce that phobia in people's minds that don't, for the life of you, ever consider going back to the time where the church or any organized religion can ever have any sort of role in your life besides a personal role. And that kind of understanding is fed to us in our schools. When we study history and we're taught about what they refer to as the Dark Ages, and they tell you about the vices of the past. Again, tradition is not in reference to the past, but we have to be very fair in our treatment of the past. Yes, in the past, within the Western and Eastern world, there were many vices that were rid of through developments and developing thought, different philosophies, different worldviews, which we'll touch upon, be it modernism or postmodernism. They do have vices, but they have virtues as well, and there are recognizable positives and accomplishments that we have to be fair and give justice to. For example, what was mentioned in Shaykh Abdul Rahman's lecture with regards to fighting against inequality, that took a rise during the postmodern era. During the modern era, things of the rise of science, medicine, the discoveries that took place that really pushed humanity and led us to take leaps within the world and connected us with one another, that those accomplishments are directly attributed to science that took the center stage during the modern era. So we recognize that, we recognize those accomplishments. In the same way, we have to recognize that in the past, what was referred to us as the Dark Ages, we take for granted and we believe that title completely, which Dark Ages denotes what? Absolute darkness. There was no light whatsoever. And that's why the period that came later was referred to as the Enlightenment. Finally, there was a chance for human beings to breathe, science to breathe, thought to breathe. And so it's not in reference to that time, but we have to also say that at that time, there were pros, there were positives, and there were accomplishments. There were symbols and there were approaches to life and an understanding of the position of the human being and with regard to creation and the entire universe, what their role was. So even during those times, right, they weren't, in our humble opinion, completely dark, although we would never wish to be transported to that time. It's just the same way people say that to the argument, go back home politically, if you start to talk about, the virtues of being back home or the values that we have back home, they say, well, go back to your country. Right? In the same way they say, okay, well, why don't you go back and live in those times if you like it so much? So when we say tradition, once again, it's not in reference to a historical time period. It's not in reference to culture. It's in reference to having God in your life, returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and living a God-centric life where God is at the center, not the human being or anything else. That's what it's in reference to. And that applies today. It applied 100 years ago and applied 1,000 years ago. So I just wanted to make that clarification so that hopefully after this conference or after the session, that question doesn't come up again. It might do, but I don't mind. You can ask questions, but because again, you will come across it. And it is vital that we're able to articulate ourselves with regards to our personal beliefs in the West, within the Western context. Another thing we have to realize, and it's necessary to point out, that although these ideas were born in the West, that does not mean, and the statements that were made is not to say that they do not in one way, shape, or form affect the East. We live in a time where we are connected to one another. In fact, inshallah, maybe I'm jumping here a little bit because it's part of the prepared slides, but the fact that modernism took over the East was by virtue of the fact that we were not prepared. Intellectually, we were not prepared for what was coming. Philosophy was dead, except in very few regions. That when these things came and these thoughts were brought over, nobody was there to combat them. In fact, it was embraced. It was something new. It was something different. And as such, the consequences of adopting those worldviews in our countries led to destruction of traditional civilization, in essence, right? So you'll see this in the article, but they also intersects with the session that we're having today, because you can't talk about the destruction of traditional civilization without talking about the worldview that was adopted that led to that destruction and the sufferings that we are going through today. Again, not to paint a bleak and dark picture, not to say that the world that we live in, that there's no hope or that it's dark now, and we don't want to fall victims or fall into the same sin or error that we just accused our predecessors who described it back then as the Dark Ages. Now we're describing today as the Dark Ages. That's not what we're trying to say. We're trying to say that that there's an issue that we have to be aware of. And the only way to be aware of this issue is to live an examined life, not an unexamined life. Being an individual who's aware of the area that they live in and the philosophies that exist and that govern the world that they're in or the institution that they're in, be it in whatever field that you are. Because whether you are conscious of it or not does not change the fact that it is there and that it is affecting you in one way or another, whether you are focused on it or not. That's why some authors mention that worldview is something on the periphery. It's something that it's always there, it's present in your sight, but if you don't focus on it, then you'll never know what's going on. You'll never be able to see it. But that does not change the fact that it exists and that it impacts you. And in the words of another author, he says that we recognize this in psychology, and that the background, right, or the background affects the foreground, meaning that if something is in the background, it changes your perception of what a thing is. If the same thing is taken and the background is changed, this can apply socially, it can apply artistically, it can apply in various ways. It can change your entire perception. So it being in the background, it does affect our lives in various ways, and that's what we hope to explore today, inshallah. So when it comes to worldview, what is meant by worldview? Now, the word worldview is the word chosen for the conference today. But in reality, when you go over various works in philosophy, you'll find that different definitions are given. The one chosen for this conference entails worldview. So to give a better understanding of what it is, we can say that the religious worldview is one that views that there is a creator to the universe. There is a creator that created not just man, but the universe itself. That there is not only a physical reality, but there exists a metaphysical reality. In contrast to another worldview that exists that says that reality is limited to that which is physical and that which is sensory. Others say that no, reality is limited to that which is physical, sensory, and also non-sensory, but the non-sensory has no value. Meaning, we recognize that there are things that have an existence, like emotions and feelings and things of that nature, but their value or their relation to reality is none, right? They exist in the sense that I can recognize them and they are there, but in concept. So they recognize things that are non-sensory, but they don't say there is such thing as a metaphysical reality, as the Muslim or the believer does. The underlying theme or the underlying point that I want to make today is that I don't want to go into the details, meaning I don't want to talk about what the Muslim perception of that creator is for a very specific reason. I don't want to talk about our understanding of who the creator is. I want to talk about the concept of a creator in general. This has to do with why it matters. When we talk about why it matters, we always want to bring things down to ourselves. And this defeats the purpose. The purpose and what I hope to achieve in this short amount of time that I have with you is that we come out of this room understanding that or having a correct worldview and doing something about it impacts me and everybody around me, regardless of faith, regardless of sect, right? Meaning that what's at danger today, that danger that exists, or that danger that we're trying to highlight, or that siren that we're trying to ring, or that alarm, is to say that that affects me and everybody else who believes in the existence of a metaphysical reality, regardless of faith. And hope that in this realization, one can transcend these differences to combat other worldviews that eliminate in concept or in teaching the belief in a metaphysical reality. Meaning the danger is not just on me. The danger is on me and the Christian and the Jew and the Hindu, right? And many others. Meaning those who believe in the existence of a creator, their position and the existence of a metaphysical reality, their position is at risk. And that doesn't just affect me as a Muslim, but affects my neighbor too. In turn, the opposition to such worldviews and the attempt to create a change will not be one that just involves one group and not the other. Rather, the awakening that has to take place, or the examination of one's worldview, should be collective. That it doesn't just apply to me. This is something that is universally applicable. So, the religious worldview, what we will categorize as the divine worldview, is one that sees that there is a physical reality and a metaphysical reality. The next worldview, what we would categorize as a materialist worldview, says that the only reality is that which is physical. Now, the manifestation of these worldviews can take place, or can take various forms and different names, right? Whether it's scientism, whether it's naturalism, whether it's humanism, all these things, modernism, all these names that are given to it can fall under that category of what? The material worldviews. And these are the things that permeate our society. Likewise, the divine worldviews, if we're looking at them as two categories, you can add under that category anything that entails the belief in a creator, and in a creator not just of the human being, but of the universe, of creation itself, an ultimate creator, and the metaphysical reality. The reality is that our worldview is one that we take generally for granted. Meaning the question becomes that, okay, well, we all recognize as Muslims, this is a Muslim conference, that there is a creator, and that he exists, and that there is a hereafter, and we're here to educate ourselves. So what is the need to re-emphasize the need to examine one's worldview? First of all, we have to make clear that as Muslims, in terms of Islamic law, in terms of the Sharia, it's incumbent upon every individual to go on their own journey with regards to reaching certainty in their belief, primarily in their belief in God. Meaning this isn't an examination of, that sort of an aristocratic exercise, or an exercise for those with an interest in philosophy. Rather, whether you're interested in philosophy or not, it's wajib on you. It's compulsory as a Muslim to know how God exists, who God is, what God is like. It's not something that is mustahab. It's something that is wajib. So this examination is part and parcel of being a Muslim. You cannot take it from your marja' taqleed. You cannot take it in the same way that you take your laws. You have to individually go on that journey and analyze and examine your own beliefs and the world around you and yourself, and come to that conclusion with regards to the principles of your faith. So it's not an exercise of individuals who have extra time on their hands, or those who are interested in reading, go and read about it. No, every single individual, at least from the perspective of the Islamic tradition, it's incumbent upon them that they come to the conclusion themselves. So from a Sharia perspective, it's something that is wajib, but it's something that is neglected and something that we take for granted. Why do we take it for granted? Is the human being inclined not to live an examined life? No, that's not the case. Human beings innately have that desire to know the answers to why. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, in a beautiful narration, he says that may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on the one who's able to answer the following three questions and prepare for their hereafter. From where, and to where. Right? So, min ayn, fi ayn, wa ila ayn. These are three fundamental questions that Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam identifies and says that every human being has to come to, may God have mercy on the human being that comes to the conclusion, who is able to answer these questions. And we find that these questions are at the core of every single human being. In that, the human being is concerned with their origin. Their search is for purpose, is for meaning. That exists. That's why individuals, like for example, scientists and things of that, individuals like that, or non-fiction writers, they'll write stories of alternate universes and they'll go into sci-fi and things of that nature, right? This is a desire, a search for something outside of themselves, something beyond that which they have interacted with and that which they understand. That's why scientists go and search for evidence of life outside our universe, right? It's a search for purpose, it's a search for our origin, where we come from. Now, in the modern era, because of the prevalence of science, how did that take place? Through scientific means. We look outside. We go and search for water on the moon and the planets, because we think that everything that is real and everything that we know is all around us. And I didn't find my answer here. Maybe my answer is out there. So we recognize that this first question, from where, is an innate question. Everybody wants to know from where. Even on a personal level, you go and you see, videos of celebrities and people, who go and look up their ancestry and they want to know about their past. They want to come to some sort of, answer about who they are, the traits that they have. It gives them a sense of solace within them. The second question is where. The human is concerned with their purpose and the nature of reality and the world that they live in. This world that I live in, what is it like? It's mysterious. We're attacked on a daily basis with multiple conflicting worldviews. One is a understanding of reality that we receive at home. The second, which is more traditional in nature, and traditional again, quote unquote, religious in nature. And then that which we learn in school, which is more modern in nature. I don't know what schooling is like today. From what Shaykh Abdurrahman is saying, it's more postmodern in nature. Well, it would also be, to an extent or another, conflicting in nature with my initial understanding and upbringing at home. And then one that I experience on a daily basis. And so there's a clash that's taking place. As such, I struggle as a human being to try to understand what the world is like, why it is the way that it is, and how I'm supposed to navigate it. This is something that's also innate within the human being. The third question indicates that the human being is concerned with finitude, in death. Where are they going? What is after this life? Is there an afterlife? Is this it? Is this the end? I was reading a book for Gertrude Bell, who I referenced in the Palestine discussion. And she talked about Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And she talked about how his story remained alive throughout history. And it shakes individuals. And it was a beautiful description, although she wasn't, I would say, a person that I would perceive that had good intentions. But she said it's as if that human fear of disappearing, right? That he didn't have that. That the world had graced him with immortality through his remembrance. And that human fear of just disappearing and fear of the unknown and going into the abyss and vanishing, she said, right, was not present in Hussein alayhi salam because of the immortality of the story of Ashura and how it's been kept preserved throughout centuries. But she was describing a very intimate feeling, which is the fear of disappearing, the fear of leaving this world, of vanishing, and the need to have your mark and a legacy. This is also part of human nature. These three things are there. If these three things are there, and you're saying they're so important, then why does the human being not pursue them? Why are they not pursued? Why are they ignored? Why are the majority of human beings living unexamined lives? Precisely because of the modern worldview, first and foremost, that does not view these questions to have any value. They consider them to be questions that cannot be solved through traditional means. They consider that the human being should be utilitarian, meaning he should rather do other things than busy himself with these age-old, archaic questions and try to find the answers through other means, you see. Meaning that we live busy lives. The world that we live in, the systems that we are under, be it social, political, or economical, are built in such a way in which the human being does not have time to ponder such things. They don't. Or they are schooled in such a way in which the answer seems far-fetched. And when you try to get an answer from the scientists, or you try to get an answer through the means or within the field that you're in, you are attacked with varying, not attacked in the sense that you are attacked for asking the question, rather with multiple views that are contradictory, and views that are not fixed and not stable, even with regards to the origins of humanity. Meaning day after day, I'm subscribed to several scientific journals, and I can say that within the past 2-3 months, there have been several articles, each of them changing certain specific dates and realities with regards to Homo sapiens and when they were on the earth and the new discoveries that they found. They cannot give a concrete answer to the individual. And so the individual is left lost. Either lost in terms of when they attempt to pursue, or lost and busy in terms of the busy life that they are living. These things and these questions aren't deemed questions that have value. And so these are some of the challenges that the individual goes through, and challenges that the modern day poses to the individual. And that's why a return to a traditional life is a return to those initial principles and to those initial questions, and re-examining not only our understanding of who we are, where we are, and where we are going, but what we've been learning and what systems exist today and the consequences of these systems. There have been reactionary movements to the modernization of the world as well. And this is what I refer to as people's fear of the word tradition. See, within the Muslim world, when these ideas penetrate, and some people recognize the innate danger of these things. And this also, by the way, took place in the West, meaning individuals that took issue with or were dissatisfied with not knowing the answers to these questions, began to look elsewhere. They began to look to the East. And you find the rise in yoga and the rise in Hindu thought and Buddhist thought within the West. People looked for alternative means to answer these innate cravings and these innate questions that they had. Within the Eastern world, people tried to turn back to what they refer to as Salafism or Wahhabism. The phenomena of the Salafi or the Wahhabi is also an attempt to gain clarity. Why? What does the word Salaf mean? The word Salaf means returning to a period of time that is closest to the Prophet, closest to that period of origin, period of revelation. To that period of revelation. Considering it the one that is most clean, pure, and filtered of all the pollution that exists afterwards. An attempt to find clarity. An attempt to combat that which I cannot maybe articulate why it is a danger or why it is something that I oppose, but rather I understand that innately. I can see the consequences in front of me. Most people are like that. And again, not to jump from topic to topic, but to make it more meaningful, because what I hope is that from these sessions that you can take something home with you. For example, with regards to the Palestinian question. And I mentioned this in that discussion. How can it apply to that context? In that if we recognize that there is an issue, and our recognition of this, if we recognize that there's an issue and there's a problem, and our recognition is limited, and we say that the issue of Palestine, for example, is a limited problem, it is a singular problem, and that's a problem of a people and an occupation, and that occupation has to end, then we will only tackle that problem from that aspect. We recognize that something greater is wrong, but the only the thing that we can identify immediately is the occupation. But the reality is, there's something beyond that. The reality is, if I want to look at the big picture, worldview is also referred to as the big picture. If I want to look at the bigger picture, is that even if Palestine, the occupation of Palestine ends, then there are other things that are occupied as well. The universities are occupied by academics and by instructions and by institutions that are enforcing a worldview that is contrary to those principles that exist within those lands and the beliefs of those people. That's not just the Palestine and all over the Middle East, first and foremost. The occupation isn't just the occupation of a land. It's the occupation of academic institutions. It's the occupation of medical institutions. It's there. That there is no alternative. There are many academics within Harvard and Stanford and Yale who are banned from publishing their articles within those journals because they do not conform to certain, they're allowed to teach, but they're not allowed to publish, to certain standard beliefs that are taught within the schools and academic institutions throughout the USA, maybe contrary to certain theories. They're not allowed to publish their works. When you look at countries in the East, for example, in China, the Chinese learn about China through the works of whom? Through the works of recognized academics that the West recognizes. So there's only one narrative that is being pushed. So the idea is that similarly, when we look at the issues that exist, when we recognize these issues and we can identify certain things, we want to return, and people want to return to a tradition that can answer certain questions for them. They don't want to continue living without having the answer to these questions. So they assume that the purest form is the one closest to the original. What they assume is the original. And when you look at the Salaf period, you're like, what are you talking about? Barakat al-Jamal, everything that took place, Karbala, killing, all these things. It's like, it's not an ideal. It also has its problems. The problem started from then, from the time that the Khilafah was taken from Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. But we're looking at it from the context of why did that person go there in the first place. We are in the same position, in that the human being today, or the Muslim today, is also faced with these challenges. Is also faced with the challenge of attempting to answer these questions within the context of their daily life and the field that they're in and everything that they've learned and understood. How the world around us and the environment that we're in and this hegemony that does exist of certain worldviews that seep into every field, like we mentioned, whether it's medicine or education or politics or economics, affects us. I think that main clarification would be made during the Shaykh's lecture. Beauty is the splendor of the truth, right? In that the environment that we're in initiates us into a certain understanding, and that symbols that exist around us initiate us into a certain understanding, and that there's a human need for symbolism. There's a human need within the realm, within the physical realm, for images and symbols and teachings and principles that reconnect them to that divine origin, that reconnect them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that reconnect them to truth. Because once they are initiated into truth, only then can they find peace and harmony. If they're initiated into falsehood, they'll find an internal what? Chaos. They'll never be satisfied. It will never be enough. But the whole goal is that you should not be initiated into that truth. They want to initiate you into this false perception and these false idols and these false gods that they have created. And these are the references made in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the individual who takes their desire as their Lord, when the individual who takes idols. When you look at the Quran and the references within the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, begins to talk about idol worship and begins to talk about these things, you might ask yourself, how is this relevant to me today? How does this apply to me today? How many people do we know worship statues, for example, today? But the reality is we recognize that these are symbols. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a hadith Qudsi tells Nabi Dawood, "Oh David, purify your home." He says, what is the home? Is the home, what home can continue Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? He says, the heart. He says, this home, how do I purify it? He says, light a fire within it that burns everything that I dislike and attracts everything that I love and like. This is the home. The home that in the Islamic tradition is synonymous with the Kaaba. The Kaaba is at once referred to as the house of God, the physical house of God, but the heart is referred to as the Kaaba. And then we look at the Quran to see Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa breaking those idols. And those idols that were placed within the Kaaba. So there are symbols. These are all symbols of things that we can understand. Of these idols that exist today, they're not physical. They are worldviews. They are philosophies that we have to recognize in order to break. And in order to do so, we have to live an examined life. We have to understand what our worldview is. What does it mean to be somebody who believes in the existence of a metaphysical reality? What does it mean to be an individual who believes in the existence of a God and the existence of a hereafter? How does that impact me? How is it something that is beyond the personal? I gave the reference, I don't know if it was in the Palestine war or the last one, to what took place during COVID. Meaning those who didn't have that worldview and had a worldview that was limited to the physical world. What was their response to the COVID pandemic? Is that the human being or those that were elders or seniors should die out. It's a natural law. It's a law of the jungle. This is the law of nature. Nature is like that. Why should we oppose it? Why should we oppose it? There is no sacredness to human life. There is no sacred aspect to human dignity. I can justify colonizing the world. When did the colonial period begin? Also, it was during the modern times, right? Under what pretext? Under what pretext? On the pretext that this is the way that it works. That the one who is strong and powerful, he has the upper hand. He should dominate. He should control. He should conquer. When I look at nature, that's the way that it is. When you watch any nature documentary, that's the way that the animal's behavior is narrated. As it's a world in where they're killing one another. There's the prey and there's the predator only. That's the only aspect of the natural world that's highlighted constantly and it's put in your mind and repeated time and time again. That this is the nature of the world. And when they say nature, they're trying to say this is the reality of the world. They're trying to normalize it. This is what it is. You don't like it. This is all fantasy. This is what you would like to believe. This is what you want to make yourself feel better. But it was under this pretext that they went and colonized and they called these other civilizations that existed the white man's burden. The white man was burdened. He had to free these societies. He had to educate these lesser peoples, right? And lift them out of their ignorance. And this was the context that they used. The same individuals, the same principles that they relied on are the principles that we unknowingly as Muslims within our respective fields rely on when we teach, when we learn, when we educate, when we interact with the greater world. Meaning that although we recognize the existence of a metaphysical reality, when I get sick, I don't perceive that sickness to might be as a result of something beyond the physical world or beyond something that I ate. I cannot even consider it to be as a result of sin, as a result of other factors, behaviors, or words that I said, interactions that I had. That doesn't even come to mind. Unless I read a narration or go to a lecture, that wouldn't be my initial consideration. My initial consideration would be the natural consequences. What are they? Did I eat something bad? I wouldn't think, did I backbite? Did I do something? Did I miss a prayer? That's not even part of the equation. The sickness, it's a physical ailment, right? And so I look for a physical cause. It has consequences, although I am one who adopts what? A religious worldview. In reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not really a part of my life beyond certain aspects or certain scopes of my life. Yani Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is part of my life only when I'm on the prayer mat. But beyond that, within my home, within the decor of my home, within the way that I dress, within what I own, within the way that I live, the food that I eat, how I sleep, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no presence. And this is what is referred to, or what was referred to as, if they wanted to, as one of the European philosophers said, kill God, that they have to destroy every symbol of God. Meaning they could not eliminate God, but they could eliminate every symbol of His existence or His remembrance from society, be it in the field of education or be it in the field of art and architecture. And what does that do in consequence? In consequence, you unconsciously or subconsciously, when you are reacting to the world around you, God is not part of the equation. He's not. You speak and you look, and when you go to the prayer mat, you pray like one who believes in God, but in every other facet of your life, He's not there. And this is precisely what is meant by returning to the principle or returning to tradition, is bringing God or the sacred, the truth, back into your life in every aspect, and rediscovering what it means to be a human being, where you are and where you're going and where you came from. From what? From a spiritual lens, from the lens of tradition, and seeing what it has to say and what there is to discover. And the only way to do that, brothers and sisters, is to do that collectively, meaning that there has to be a collective awareness. It's not, and it's, of course, the wujub that we refer to is individual wujub. It's compulsory on the individual, but it has to happen collectively. It has to happen collectively for it to take effect. And we have to have that recognition in order to do what? In order to combat it in every field. And again, we have to recognize, as mentioned earlier, that there were achievements that came about from the modern world, and there were accomplishments, and even the postmodern world. But the issues, I think, has been made clear by the lectures that you've heard so far, that the issue isn't in it's not an absolute rejection of that philosophy. It's to say that that philosophy is limited to a certain field, and it does not encompass the entirety of reality. And that's the problem. The problem is when I want to approach truth, when I want to approach reality from a scientific perspective, I can't, because reality isn't limited to the physical. I can't experiment on anything. I can't apply the scientific method to other things, to things of value, even to those that are asensory, those that I cannot sense, but I recognize. I cannot use the scientific method on it. It's limited. Even the postmodernists, although they championed certain values, and today our sentiments towards certain oppressions or our sensitivity to oppression is much higher. And you can say that humanity, to a large extent, is becoming more humane and more sensitive to certain injustices that are taking place. If you look at pictures, for example, of when they colonized, when they went to Australia and took the Aborigines, you find them in chains, women and men and children playing around. You'd find videos of Victorians in the Victorian area throwing food to children that are running down on the ground and they're eating, as if they're animals in Africa, right? Those things today would cause an uproar. So there is an advancement, there is an accomplishment. But the idea is when I take this and I want to apply it to the entirety of reality and neglect the traditional perspective. Instead, we have to say that no, everything has to be put in its place like Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam said. Everything has to be put in its place as Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam said. Yani science has a role and it has a function and it has a use and it can help the individual reach certain conclusion with regards to reality. And that's why I always emphasize to the brothers and sisters that as I cannot say that I've read every article that comes out with regards to, for example, string theory, but I do read it. It is relevant to me what takes place. It's not a rejection of science. It's not saying that we want to go and say that all these things were bad. Rather, it's to put things in their place. There is a place for science, and there are things that science can deal with. And that is the realm of the physical realm, or the realm of nature. It can deal with it within its scope and within its ability. And analyzing it from a physical perspective, from a material perspective. But it cannot go beyond that. But you see that there have been attempts. I remember I get a phone call when I'm in Qom from a friend who is an engineer in the Imperial College. I think I mentioned him in the Palestine context of that discussion as well. And he sends me a book by somebody whose last name was Hariri or something. And he wrote a book about the origin of human beings. I'm reading it, and I said, this is... he's, by the way, mind blown. He finds it very exciting. And I'm surprised. I said, first of all, the quality of writing wasn't that impressive. But that aside, it was like, it was as if they were trying to create a Genesis story for human beings, an alternative that one can take to the Bible. Because when you look at the main atheists, be it Hitchens or Dawkins, their main concerns are Christianity and Christian arguments for the existence of God and things of that nature, but not the Muslim understanding of it, right? With exception of a few, and even those who have written to attack the Muslim perspective or the Muslims' worldview, they haven't done a really good job in research. They were pretty much lazy. I think when you get to that point in academia and you've been teaching and writing for 20, 30 years, it's hard to humble yourself and go and learn about a religion from the very beginning, because your departure point is a point of bias to begin with. You know, when you read Dawkins, it's different than when you hear him. When you hear him, you might get the impression, well, you see the arrogance is there, but you might get the impression that that person can be calm at times, can be articulate at times. But when you read his works, it's very obnoxious. And you realize these people are completely arrogant and they have nothing to provide the human being. Other than the fact, as I mentioned in the previous lecture in the Fall of Traditional Civilization, that their track record isn't good. And that's what the postmodernist argument is that look at what you've done. All the colonization, all the killing, all the destruction, all the injustice that took place, taking advantage of people and destroying societies and destroying the world. So what are you offering, right? But the reality is, if we don't look at it if we don't take a step back and look at the big picture, we are easily sold the story too. And we become part and parcel of the problem. And even, how much, just to end on this note then, I'd say from a spiritual perspective, we become part and parcel of the problem as well. Meaning that if we do not embrace a life and a worldview, not a worldview in terms of conceptualization, not a worldview in terms of I am a Muslim and I believe that God exists, a worldview that I embrace and that I apply in my everyday life, meaning bringing the sacred back into my life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the belief in His existence into my life. If that doesn't practically manifest itself, what we call tawheed in the af'al, in my actions, right? When I say I believe in God, that should translate into action as well. Sometimes I'm part of the problem in that when I deal with my child and when I deal with my spouse, I allow them to give in to certain understandings, or I'm pushing certain agendas or certain narratives within my home itself that go contrary to my own principles. That awareness starts at home. That awareness starts with understanding that when I'm sending off my child, or I'm sending off my child either to school or to university, and I don't arm them with the correct tools to defend themselves and to understand their identity and who they are, then who's to blame? Us first and foremost. So the idea is that if we're here, and we are here and now, we have to arm ourselves with the tools to navigate the world correctly. Or else the issue of the ignorance of the Arabs that led to their colonization and the destruction of their civilization through modernization is going to repeat itself. Because we don't have a living tradition, or our tradition is not alive within our hearts and within our homes. And that begins by living an examined life. What does it mean to be a Muslim? How relevant is that question here today? Especially within the Western context. What does it mean to be a Western Muslim? What does it mean to hold these beliefs? How am I supposed to navigate the Western landscape? How am I supposed to navigate the landscape of my university, of my school, of my society, of my community? What is my role? What is my responsibility? How many times do we hear this question time and time again? So it's time that we take action and try to resolve it. Beginning with what? Beginning with living a life in which, living a traditional life. Living a life in which the sacred is within our hearts, and those principles are upheld. And we take a step towards living a life in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not only conceptually, not only internally part of our lives, but practically part of our lives, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.